playing with Speed.
Ready, Ray?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the formal fashions of Motown, like Diana Ross and Martha Reeves, where they wore their ball gowns and evening dresses? I mean, was Berry Gordy, trying to create a specific look, or just trying to make them more palatable to white audiences?
Well, I don't really know Berry Gordy, and so I don't really quite know what he was thinking. My impressions are, and it's easy to have impressions in retrospect, were that that was the style of the day, as I explained earlier, in terms of Christian Dior's La Belle Époque remodeled. And they saw it as something that really gave these young girls a great sense of decency, respect, importance, glamour. They wouldn't want them to be dressing in tracksuits or whatever was the kind of style that you would have gone to school in at the time, or the kind of style, if you were out at school, you would have gone down to the running track or the bowling alley. They wanted them to dress as if you were at an all-night party and you had nothing else to do but party, party, party. And they all looked like they were coming from a big party, and they looked like they were going off to another one. It was that eternal festive spirit, almost this Cinderella dream of constantly going to the ball. They all looked like they were off to some great ball with their chiffons in the pastel creams and pinks and greens and blues and big bows all done up and modeled. It was, if you look in a Dior sketchbook of the 50s, you'll see the role models of which those dresses were made from, and that was it. It was the everlasting ball. Well, La Belle Époque, that's what it was called, La Belle Époque, the naughty 90s.
Well, moving along from there then, we'll go into the Beatles, so the next big influence here.
Yeah.
They wore these sort of matching lapel-less suits.
Yes,
and
round collars.
Right. Now, how were the Beatles perceived in those outfits by the hip people in London?
Well, the hip people in London, as the hip people usually in fashion in most places, dare I say, often gay. In those days in London, which was the early 60s, there was this gay strip called Carnaby Street, where most people who shopped there were gay. Tiny little boutiques in the backwater of the main thoroughfare of Regent Street, predominantly run by gays, and they had little hipster trousers. That was trousers that really started from your hip and went down rather than from your waist. They were stovepipe in shape, which meant a continuous line, or tried to look as if they had a continuous line rather than were shaped around the leg. They tended to imitate what we called in London those days continental style, because we never really felt that we were anything to do with Europe. We were this isolated island. So anything that came from Paris, France, or Italy, which were two major important fashion influences, we used to call continental. And I remember those shops in those days had people like Adam Faith and Sean Connery, were these sort of models who would wear fancy swimwear and stuff and sort of canoodle on little rocks, and you'd see them in these sort of various Dance and Dancers type books. They were the models, actual models, and the style that you're talking about, the Beatles, you see, started in Germany. They were a little bit influenced by fashion, but not very much. They were really looking in those days more like the old rock and rollers, leather jackets, etc. I think when they suddenly hit back to Liverpool and formed a relationship with Brian Epstein, and were suddenly aware that they were coming to London to try to become a hit group, they had to get dressed up. And at the time, there was another French designer. Oh, I'm afraid that's the air conditioning. I don't know how that turns.
Speed.
Okay, yeah. Picking up with the Beatles on Carnaby Street, like with Brian Epstein.
Right. Well, I think what happened was that they needed to obviously get dressed up. And I don't know whether it was their intention, but certainly I think one of the original members who apparently departed in some big boil up. He didn't carry favour with Epstein. I think his name was Stuart Goddard, and I think his girlfriend, who was German. It's funny how a lot of Germans tend to end up as girlfriends of rock groups in England. I don't know why, but they do. Anyway, she devised a sort of a hairstyle, as far as I understand, which was this mop top, which was putting your hair right down to just above your eyes, and then cutting right round like a porridge bowl. And it was very different. It wasn't anything like the gays and people were wearing in London at the time, which was tend to be very back-combed hair, a little like Rod Stewart still wears today, because he was one of those original West End boys and always had this big back-combed continental look and would wear a polo neck sweater in black and tight trousers, and that was a sort of, I think that was a sort of a West End dandy of the day, particularly living in the twilight of the small jukeboxy, coffee bar, R&B clubs that were around them. So the Beatles were very different. They came in suited, and the suits with the round collars, collarless and had a crew neck collar, were suits that were originally designed by a French designer again. This time his name was Pierre Cardin, and it was the Pierre Cardin style that suddenly you'd see in the Daily Mirror and the various Fleet Street newspapers as a current new shape for men, and this was quickly imitated in Carnaby Street, where fashion was a ploy and a use for gays to get dressed up in, and that was where all the temperature of the day was, where you could discover whatever was cool, because there wasn't such a thing as King's Road. There really wasn't, and this is the other thing you must understand, there wasn't ever, up until I think about 1965, shops specifically created to sell to you fashion if you were young and rock and roll inspired and you wanted to be fashionable. That industry had not been created because most people, always wore the same thing as their father and their mother, and that changed in the 50s, but there was still not specific stores in the 50s. As I told you, the Dior thing was a style, and that style you could buy those clothes in any store. It wasn't as if those people had to go to a particular store to get that frock and that skirt or that look. No, any store had them. So in the 60s, in London, I don't know about America, but in London there was just this one little strip called Carnaby Street. And I think that's where the Beatles, or if they didn't, it was some back East End or Liverpudlian tailor who was given, again, a role model of the Pierre Cardin suit, which is what they copied. The little black velvet touches on the collars were really a leftover from the English rock and roll look of the time, which was different from your look in the sense that we tended to marry, and this was due again to the gay contingent in London, marry what was a predominantly fashionable style at the time, which was the reintroduction, funnily enough, of the Edwardian look. And this Edwardian look, really, for men, was about very tapered, very thin, and very long jackets below your knees, in fact, coming almost onto your calves. Well, the gay boys, who were into also a lot of muscle pumping in those days, tended to marry that with the American look, which was the big wide-shouldered gangster things that you could see in most American B movies at the time. That wide zoot-suited jacket and the Edwardian draped look, very long, and obviously in Edwardian times the velvet collar, became the teddy boy jacket. And teddy comes from the word Eddie, which is Edwardian, so we called them teddy boys. Teddy boys were your rock and roll culture of the day. That's what the Englishman looked like, and the English kid would be in maroons or greys or different kinds of shades of grey or black or navy, and they would wear black velvet collars. Well, the Beatles kept those little black collars as it was a throwback, really, from the days of rock and roll style. Their major difference was the haircut. That really was very different, and nobody in London, and I remember seeing them myself, I was about 12 or 13 years, and I went to a club in Piccadilly, and Please Please Me had hit the #1 spot, and I remember them coming out, and The most staggering thing, because we all in London never were too sure about this Liverpudlian sound, which seemed to be a copy that we would all listen hard on the American Hot 10, which was the only radio station or radio show that we could get American songs from. And we realised there was this sound called the Detroit sound, which, as you noted, was Berry Gordy's creation. Groups like the Marvelettes, Please Mr. Postman, and songs like that. And these were the songs in the repertoire of the Beatles. And we knew the Beatles were basically a harmony group trying, in their own strange and curious and eccentric Liverpudlian fashion, to imitate this Detroit sound that Berry Gordy had created. Good tunes, good harmonies, but it was where boys were doing it, and with guitars. And that's what we saw. So we didn't really like that, because what you liked in London at that time was this rough, gritty, Englicised version of Chuck Berry, which was in the form of the Rolling Stones and groups like that. They were the muddier, they were the dirtier, they were the tougher. And the word rock and roll became was a popular word, too popular, didn't have the subversive element. We preferred R&B. R&B seemed to be something that Fleet Street didn't understand, didn't know about. It was more secretive. And Chuck Berry and these people were the roots of R&B. So we said, we don't want to know about being a rock and roll band. We want to be go and see a R&B band. The Rolling Stones in interviews said, we're not rock and roll, we're R&B. Because rock and roll was like all kind of... It was all to do with things that were frilly and fizzy and produced and glossy and glittery, and didn't have the toughness or the raw approach that one was looking at. And they weren't dirty. Beatles were very clean. Rolling Stones always looked a bit rough around the edges.
Let me expand on that for a moment. Can you compare the Rolling Stones fashion-wise to the Beatles?
Yes.
And for a while they also wore no-collar jackets.
Absolutely.
Can you compare the Stones to the Beatles?
Yeah, the Beatles obviously were obviously very tailor-made, and they had this look, and they did very well by being able, I think, unlike any other group that you would see in the day, they were able to... the biggest thing with the Beatles was they sounded like the records live. That was the thing, it was just devastating. They actually sounded exactly the same, and no one could quite believe it. Some people actually think that they were just miming live, but I don't think they were. But we were absolutely staggered and thought that they're just incredible. Although the taste and lyrics and ideas of them didn't really marry very well with this cognoscenti, shall I say, rock and roll milieu or rhythm and blues milieu fashion group that existed in London. In terms of their style, it was all too prim for us. It was all too clean. The Rolling Stones took on, I suppose, what you'd call in those days, and it was a little bit of a throwback again from the 50s, but not from the 50s of Christian Dior and the prom dress, or even the teddy boy jacket that married so well with that prom dress. It was the look of the art side of things. It was the beatnik. That was still always current through what you didn't really have here, but that was this growth of art school in England at the time. You know, every town had an art school, and art schools were havens for the dispossessed. Practically every rock and roll group that existed in the 60s and in the 70s had some relationship. Those kids had somehow or another been students in an art school. Well, art school had this very existential sort of look and feel. You wore dirty clothes, because wearing clean clothes really didn't look cool. And in those days, you didn't have such things as bleached jeans. You didn't go out and buy ready-made bleached jeans. You didn't have anything like that. But the idea was always to make your clothes look old, and if you threw a bit of paint on them, or you cut them, or you tore them a little bit. And it was always to wear a white shirt that was at least 2 weeks old, okay? And I never forget seeing the Rolling Stones, with particularly Charlie Watts, with this filthy black collar, walking along Chelsea Bridge, where I was at art school in those days, and a lecturer came up to me and a group of others who were all sketching off Chelsea Bridge, the old Battersea power station. And the Rolling Stones were obviously on some photo session, and there they were, running out of Battersea Park, and they had just old rough jackets. Yes, there was one of them, I think, had a leather beetle collar, which amazingly became the term for it, but it was originally this Pierre Cardin shape. But it was all scruffy. It was rougher. Their hair was not kempt and totally porridge bowl. They were a little bit rougher. I was a little bit rougher because they took a lot more drugs. But you weren't aware of that in those days. And they weren't, they'd probably been out on the tiles all night, completely bleary-eyed. But these were the role models of which a cameraman was taking pictures, which would appear in your national daily newspapers or your current pop magazines. And they had these, I never forget these filthy white collars, and I never forget this lecturer coming up to me, which was so typical, and it just told you exactly where it was in those days. He said, "Oh God," he said, "how can anybody like this group?" He'd say, "I mean, the Beatles, they're nice, but the Rolling Stones, I mean, just look at them." And of course, we were all looking at them, but we were all totally eager to belong to that group and that gang, because the Beatles had suddenly, gee, if he likes them, it's too weird. It was off already, you see. They were very much the first crossover. Mum and dad and boy and son and daughter can all go to the Beatles together. I think that's what made them very successful very quickly, because we never had a group that basically joined the generation gap in a happy-go-lucky manner. And I never forget, when I started the Sex Pistols, Steve Jones always said he hated the Beatles when he was a little boy, and he was so pleased when they broke up. And someone asked him what the difference between the Sex Pistols and the Beatles were, and he said it was like the difference between soap and water.
Now, going back to the Stones here and stuff, do you think the success of the Stones and the Beatles started to influence their look on the fashion industry? Did the fashion industry suddenly see what had been evolving but brought to the forefront by the Stones?
I think what the fashion industry was and had always been, obviously, the protagonists of style. They didn't know how that style would be worn. They didn't know how it would be customized to kids' wishes, how they customized 50s dresses and put little fluorescent socks on their feet, which was something Christian Dior would never do, and funny little flat pumps, which is something he wouldn't do. He would have very courtly shoes with stiletto heels and beautiful seamless stockings, etc. No, and in the 60s, I think the same thing happened. I think Pierre Cardin wasn't aware suddenly his collar would be now called the Beatle collar, and there would be hundreds of factories suddenly imitating his clothes. What happened was the demand for these clothes exceeded the supply, because no one was ready to admit that there was a new kind of fashion culture on the horizon that had something to do with the continual growth of pop rock and roll music, which they really, I think in the 50s, thought it would be a passing fad. It'd come and it'd go, but it didn't. It continued to grow and grow and grow, and with it did an appetite for clothes that symbolized the same feeling. Some were a lot more, let's say, subversive than others, difference between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But in total, there was this demand. If you lived out in the suburbs and the provinces, you couldn't really find those clothes easily. If you went to the gay streets of London, Carnaby Street, you did. And what happened, which is really the next stage in the game, which told everybody where teenage fashion was at, was suddenly these gay boys couldn't stand it, because there weren't gay boys coming into the store anymore. There was all these kind of strange rock and roll kids, this kid, that kid. People were getting on trains from Blackpool because they'd seen them. They were coming in, "Have you got a Beatle collar, mate?" And of course these little gay assistants in these stores were flooded out with such people that finally, obviously, the proprietors were just bought out by much bigger and greater entrepreneurs who suddenly turned Carnaby Street into the 60s swinging London street of fashion, which was once before a very private, narrow, rather sleazy little gay boutique strip.
What about, talking about...
and that happened, and when that happened, that was it. Clothes were now a big, big industry for kids for the first time. And how did they get their new designs? How could they? Well, they began to look. They looked at what the kids wanted. They began to respond to their demands. How could they? They began to look at rock and roll groups. How did they put these clothes together? As soon as they got an idea, merchandise it. The Beatles collar, I think, was the first of that.
Let's stop right now. We'll change taste. I want to go into fashion merchandising.